Hello and welcome to the world of stories. I'm sure you're here for a bedtime story to help you drift into sleep. And so, let's begin. This is a retelling from the original tale by the Brothers Grimm. The queen was sitting at the window sewing and thinking about her baby who will be born soon. As she sewed, she pricked her fingers and red blood fell on the snow by the window ledge. I wish that my daughter be as white as snow, as black as ebony, and as red as blood, she said to herself, and so it happened. Her tiny daughter had snow-white skin, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, so she was called Snow White. But the queen died, and the king married again. His new wife was very beautiful, but she had a cold heart, and she did not love Snow White. Every morning, the new queen would look into her magic mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest in the land?" And the mirror would always reply, "Thou, O queen, thou art fairest in the land." So the queen was content. 7 years passed, and Snow White grew into a lovely young girl with her mother's gentle nature. One morning, the queen looked into her mirror as usual, but the mirror's reply filled her with a very deep envy. "Thou, O queen, thou art indeed fair, but Snow White is the fairest in the land." She ordered her woodsman to kill Snow White, but she could not bear to do such a wicked deed, so he hid Snow White deep in the forest. Poor Snow White wandered about until she was utterly weary. Suddenly, she caught sight of a light through the trees in the distance. It came from a small house with a lantern glowing in one small window. The door swung open at her touch, so she stepped inside. Everything was as neat as a new pin. A scrubbed wooden table was set, with 7 plates and 7 cups. 7 little chairs were ranged around the fireplace, and along the back wall there were 7 little beds, each with a brightly colored blanket. There was a basket of logs beside the fireplace, and Snow White soon had a cheerful fire going. She sat in one of the little chairs, and before long was fast asleep. Now the cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs, and when they came home that evening, they were very worried to discover Snow White fast asleep. They tiptoed around preparing their suppers, but as the wonderful smell of stew filled the room, Snow White awoke with a start. She was very surprised to see 7 little faces looking at her, but soon she was telling them how she came to be in the forest. They were very angry when they heard about the wicked queen. "Might I stay with you?" asked Snow White. "I could look after you and have supper ready for you every night." The dwarves were just delighted with this suggestion, and immediately set about making Snow White her own chair by the fireplace, and her own bed. Back in the castle, the queen looked into her mirror in the morning and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest in the land?" But you can imagine her rage when the mirror replied, "Thou, O queen, thou art indeed fair, but Snow White with the 7 dwarfs does dwell, and she is fairest in the land." So the wicked queen disguised herself as an old peddler and searched out the dwarf's cottage. Snow White did not recognize the queen and invited her in. "Goodness me, you need new laces for your dress," said the old woman, and she pulled the new laces so tightly that Snow White was unable to breathe. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they were horrified to discover Snow White lying on the floor, as if dead. They lifted her up, and of course saw the laces. They quickly cut the tie cord, and the color came back to Snow White's cheeks. "Now you know the queen will stop at nothing," they cried. "You must not let anyone indoors again." The queen looked in her mirror the next morning, and went white with rage when they told her Snow White was still the fairest in the land. She disguised herself as a gypsy, selling wooden pegs and combs. Snow White remembered that the dwarfs had said it would not open the door. But the gypsy passed one of the combs through the window, and the minute it touched her hair, Snow White fell down in a faint, for the comb was poisoned. When the dwarfs came home and found Snow White, they immediately suspected the queen. They found the comb and pulled it out, and Snow White sat up, quite recovered. They pleaded with her to be more careful the next morning when they set off for work. So, when the farmer's wife appeared trying to sell apples, Snow White would not even open the window. "Why, anyone would think I was trying to poison you," said the farmer's wife, who was, of course, the wicked queen in disguise. "I only want to give you some apples. Look how juicy they are." And she took a big bite out of one. So Snow White thought it must be all right, and she took the apple. But the queen had poisoned it on one side, and as Snow White took a bite, she fell down dead. This time, when the dwarfs came home, there was nothing they could do. Snow White was indeed dead. They could not bear to bury her in the cold earth, so they placed her in a glass coffin. They wrote her name on the side in silver and put the coffin in a sheltered part of the forest, and planted wild flowers all around about. When the queen looked into her mirror the next morning, it gave her the answer she wanted all along. "Thou, O queen, thou art fairest in the land." Years passed. Snow White lay in her coffin, looking as beautiful as ever. The dwarves watched over her, and one day they found a young prince kneeling by the side of the glass coffin. He had fallen in love with Snow White the moment he had set eyes on her. When the dwarfs saw how deeply the prince felt about their beloved Snow White, they agreed that he take the glass coffin to his palace, where he wished to set it in his rose gardens. As the prince lifted the glass coffin, the piece of poisoned apple flew from her lips, and Snow White opened her eyes. She saw the prince. She saw her faithful dwarfs, and she cried, "Where am I? What has happened?" There was huge excitement, as everyone tried to talk at once. The prince wasted no time and asked Snow White to marry him. She agreed as long as the dwarfs could come and live at the palace as well, and they all lived happily ever after. But what of the queen? She looked in her mirror the morning Snow White and the prince were to be married. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest in the land?" The mirror replied, "Snow White, O queen. Snow White, who marries her prince today. She is the fairest in the land." The queen was so ugly in her rage that the mirror cracked from side to side, and she was never able to look in the mirror ever again as long as she lived. That's it for tonight. Thank you for listening. Have a great night. Please like and subscribe if you like my contents. I shall update daily and continue with my best efforts. Good night.